and welcome to the SCI GUYS, the show where we talk about the crazy, weird, and wonderful stories from the science world. I'm Corey, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host, the illustrious Luke Cutford.
That didn't begin with an L, that's cheating!
This week, we're talking about ascending beyond birds who steals homes.
Excuse me? What? Is it something to do with magpies?
Different bird who steals.
Okay.
I guess less steal and more installs its young in the homes of others. Do you know what bird does that?
Cuckoos.
Yes.
Yeah.
So if we're ascending over their home, what are we doing?
Oh, one flew over the cuckoo's nest.
Before we get into that, let's read a little YouTube comment. So this one says, next time anyone asks me whether I'm an alpha or a beta, I'm going to say I'm an elephant. I don't know what that's in reference to.
What does that mean?
It was on the Alpha Males episode. Maybe it was a reference, who knows? I've got a question for anyone who is watching or listening as well. If you are listening, you gotta get down to the YouTube comments. I'm looking right into the camera because we filmed this too, and you need to go to YouTube and answer this in the comments. Otherwise, something bad might happen. It won't. The question is, are you mentally ill, and have you ever been sectioned or gone to a mental hospital?
Goodness me. From cuckoos to mental illness.
Think about it.
I know.
Wonder of the cuckoo's nest.
I know.
It's a reference to the film.
Sure. I thought we were doing the science of cuckoos to begin with, to be honest. I was like, oh, what a weirdly specific episode. The science of cuckoos.
Dude, I'm doing like the QI method of like really stretching what we can fit into this topic. No, so we're talking about psychiatric wards today, or psych wards, or mental hospitals, or mental asylums, or, you know, there's many other not very nice words you could use to describe them, but that's what we're talking about today in general. So, I mean, first off, what do you know about psych wards?
They have a very bad history. We didn't used to treat people with mental illnesses very well, and we used to also classify things which we no longer classify as mental illnesses and send people to psych wards for them.
For example, being a woman, being a gay, being a transgender, which is still yeah, we
still might do that a bit. Yeah.
Oh, we're not very, like, if you're not a straight white man, chances are you were probably insane about, 80 to 100 years ago? Actually, I say 80 to 100. When I say 80 years ago, that to me is the 1920s. It is perennially 2002 for me.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that is the basics of psychiatric hospitals. Obviously, they started off being not very good, and now they are less not very good. We'll get into that today.
Yeah.
So, I mean, do you know what might sort of send you to a psychiatric hospital? How you get there? Not by car or by train, but like what circumstances lead one to going to a psychiatric hospital?
There are probably a few different ones, but I would imagine, being sectioned, which you've already mentioned, which is a sort of legal order. It's almost like being arrested for being mentally ill. It's where the government can kind of...
Sorry, that took a second for me to like... That is what it is. Like. Yeah.
It's like a government order that says that we can remove you and put you somewhere quote unquote safe because we have deemed that you're not really in control of yourself, so you need to be put into the care of the state, right?
Yeah. So I mean, sectioning, we call it sectioning. Do you know why we call it that?
Because we put them in a section that's not society.
I mean, Oh, hold on. Wait, I thought it was because of section as in Section X of the Mental Health Act.
It probably is that.
Yeah.
So I'm just pulling stuff out my ass, Corey.
Yeah. So under the Mental Health Act, you are able to take someone who is a danger to themselves and others. There's sort of certain requirements for it, and put them into a mental hospital against their will. You can also go to a mental hospital, you can
just walk
under
in.
your own will. You can walk in and say, hello, I need inpatient care. Do that, please. And they will say yes or no. And once you're in there, they might not let you leave unless you pass sort of their evaluations and whatnot. There's a number of different ways that you can sort of get in. It's kind of underfunded right now, though, it seems. So there aren't necessarily many places. So you can't be guaranteed in the UK, to walk in and say, hello, I need help with my head.
Yeah.
Give me some help. And, they'll be like, oh, yeah, come on.
That's actually really interesting. I didn't know that you could, at least in theory, treat a mental health hospital like a hospital. That's really interesting.
Well, from what I gathered, I mean, it's difficult to find information on this, and I guess this is something we could talk about today, but I really struggled to find a unified source of information from the NHS on psychiatric inpatient facilities because there's just no centralized sort of information, it seems. I go through the NHS and I end up finding like this very specific, I mean, I've got it here, inpatient mental health services, sure, but it's talking pretty specifically about Southern Health. So this is Southern Health. This isn't like, the entire NHS. This is a specific area in the UK. So it's not as, I guess, centralized as other forms of healthcare are. So it's kind of difficult to, I guess, get an overall picture of what it's like. But essentially, you can go in, you can maybe get leave from the ward, because it is literally just kind of like a hospital, but not for physical.
Yeah, but it's a hospital where like some of the doors are like double locked, and some like a zoo, when there's like a door and then like a hatch in the middle and then another door. I have a friend who was sectioned. I went to visit him in the psych ward. Yeah, so like there are like, it is like a zoo or like the International Space Station, where you like go through a door and then you have to close the first door, and then in space it gets depressurized or pressurized, and then you go through the next door, or like a zoo, when you go feed a tiger, you have to do that to make sure the tiger doesn't get out.
Luke has had a very varied life. Not only has he gone to a mental health ward, he's also gone to the International Space Station and fed tigers at a zoo, all in one day as well.
Yeah, my 20th birthday. What a ride.
But yeah, I mean, if you want to think, I think the easiest way to sort of conceptualize a mental health facility, sort of like a psychiatric ward, is a cross between a hospital and a prison, if that makes sense. Not in a bad way. I mean, well, maybe in a bad way. When I say that, what I mean is that it is very much a sort of healthcare environment. That is the focus of it. But because of the sort of restriction of your, I guess, individual rights and liberties, it does, the easiest sort of comparison one could make is a very, very low security prison, right? Think Orange is the New Black crossed with a hospital, and maybe not quite as bad as that. That's kind of what you kind of want to picture there. I mean, sort of bright lights, all of you have your shoelaces and stuff taken away. We'll get into it.
Yeah, the one I visited almost felt like a primary school as well.
Yeah.
In that it's like it's usually like a building that's in the I mean, I'm basing off the one experience which I had visiting my friend, but like it was almost like a community center.
Yes.
Right. Which is, it's just kind of sometimes what a primary school feels like in the UK.
I think we're talking about the same sorts of vibes, right? It's this sort of brightly lit, kind of nondescript, very I guess impersonal. It feels impersonal, despite the fact that there are sort of efforts to make it look
like a primary school.
Right? Yeah, exactly.
Like, stick things on the wall.
Yeah.
Nice affirmations.
Exactly. So we'll get into that today, because I've actually got some studies that look at the design of psychiatric wards. But okay, so let's talk maybe a little bit about what they are, where they've come from. Do you know when sort of mental asylums, the sort of precursor to psychiatric wards, do you know when they may have sort of come about?
I would expect like late 1800s.
That's really interesting. So I found two different sources on this. One was more sort of American and spoke about how they were in the 1800s. That's when they came about, in America specifically. Now, elsewhere I found that apparently they've been around for way longer than that. So I've got a quote here. It literally says, this is from the Science Museum. So it says, the mental asylum was the historical equivalent of the modern psychiatric hospital. The word asylum comes from the earliest religious institutions which provided asylum in the sense of refuge to the mentally ill. One of the oldest such institutions was Bethlehem, which began in 1247.
Bethlehem.
Not Bethlehem, Bethlehem.
It's really actually quite funny, because if Jesus was born today, as he was in Bethlehem, according to the story, he would definitely be put in a psych ward. One of the experiences people describe when they are probably in the throes of psychosis is they claim to be the second coming of Jesus. And it's always really interesting to me that we're like, oh, that person's crazy, but we would have done that to Jesus if Jesus was here.
Yeah, but when he started turning that water into wine, bro, Hurrah! He is out straight away.
Yeah, on day release.
So in the institution, it says Bethlehem, which began in 1247 as part of the Priory of New Order of Our Lady of Bethlehem in City of London. Christians, please, for the love of God, shorten names of churches. I can't be dealing with this. But yeah, basically, the idea of sort of a refuge for the mentally ill has been around for longer than you'd think. We're not as cruel a people as some may make you think. I mean, you might find that a lot of sort of cruelty, I feel, is a lot newer than you'd expect. Like, a lot of the modern cruelty that we just kind of take for granted, I find is kind of Victorian era stuff.
Right.
Like, like we were talking about prisons recently, and prisons are relatively new.
Yes.
I mean, we think about capitalism. Capitalism is relatively new. We think about America. America is relatively new. All of these institutions of cruelty.
Corey. Naughty. Stop it.
I'm sorry, but capitalism, prison, and America exist in the exact same point of my brain because they're the same thing. Okay, so I guess back to psychiatric wards, or rather the precursor to psychiatric wards. I mean, first off, before we really get into the history of them, I do just want to say sort of what goes on, like how you go there. So typically, according to the NHS, adult mental health inpatient services are for people who can no longer be supported at home and need to be admitted to hospital due to severe mental health problems. I mean, can you think of any examples, sort of mental health problems that might send you to a psychiatric ward?
Psychosis, schizophrenia, extreme bipolar, maybe? Yeah,
so depression, schizophrenia, or things like even dementia as well.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so I mean, it literally says here, or organic mental illnesses such as dementia. So functional, organic, either of those two can send you there. But yeah, psychosis is a big one for obvious reasons, because it is difficult to function in society when you have a different view on reality as literally everyone else.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's a difficult thing because it's one of those situations where, like, okay, to some degree, maybe we are just putting people away to not deal with them. But in other ways, it also can be really beneficial to get people help outside of the sort of pressures and stresses of, society.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, like, to operate in a society, you need to be running roughly the same software as everybody else. And if you're running different software, like, obviously you can have little bits of variation in your software, like being a capitalist or being a little bit more like a sharing person.
Yeah.
But your fundamentals need to be roughly the same to function. Yeah,
I mean, put it this way. If you're running Windows and other people are running Mac, that's probably fine, right? But if some people are running Windows, some are running Mac, and someone else is running off of some corrupted Game Boy operating system from, like, decades ago, that's not really going to fit. Like, there's a certain level of acceptable different software, as you say, but as soon as it starts getting to be basically disruptive to society, disruptive to yourself as well, that's when sort of you step in. And don't get me wrong, this is not me saying, actually society is to blame for all of these things and no one should go to psychiatric wards. I'm just highlighting that, when we talk about sort of psychiatric care, it is not always just in the best interest of the individual. Obviously, we kind of view it in a sort of through two lenses. One, through the well-being of the individual, but also the well-being of the individual in the society that we live in. We want to solve problems, but if the problem requires structural change, we'd much rather just, not do that and deal with the individual problem. And just to be clear, this is not me saying that the only reason that people get sent to psychiatric hospitals is because of society. That's not what I'm saying at all. They absolutely do and can serve a useful purpose. All I'm kind of trying to broach is the topic of, psychiatric care not necessarily just being in the best interest of the individual. It's also the best interest of the individual through the society that we live in, right? Because realistically, to help a lot of severely depressed people and, and others, restructuring society somewhat could be beneficial, but we also don't we can't just do that. So, we've got to take a more individualist approach. But we'll get more into that later. So why don't we talk a little bit about, I guess, the history of mental asylums, the precursor to modern psychiatric care. So as I said, 1247 is one of the first sort of asylums, like literally.
1247. Wow.
Bear in mind, this is a religious thing where it's like, hey, and I'm going to use some words here that may seem offensive because they are, but I'm talking in a more historical, sort of historically accurate way.
Yeah.
People that were mad or, not, like in that sort of view, just not right in the head in some way, really disruptive.
By the devil.
Yeah, and unable to look, and unable to care for themselves as well. Because bear in mind now, we've got a lot of the sort of benefits of industrialization. We've got a lot of the sort of negative outcomes of industrialization as well. But the benefits of industrialization are such that it takes less for each individual, it takes less work from each individual to care for themselves and others, right? The resources that we've got are relatively abundant. They're distributed terribly, but they are relatively abundant. So it means that the burden on any one individual to care for their own needs is far less than it would have been, in 1247, for example. So people, the problems that you can have any sort of problems you want with organized religion. I've got plenty of them, but you can't deny that in some cases it is that sort of like care for your fellow man was really bloody good. So yeah, you find that these sort of institutions, a lot of the the precursors to them were religious, because religion ran pretty much everything.
Yeah, that was the world.
Yeah, it was the world. It ran everything. But yeah, no, this is this sort of like altruistic, looking after people who can't look after themselves. That kind of began 1247-ish is one of the first ones we know of in that sort of mental asylum. So before that, it literally says here that people with mental illnesses or learning disabilities were cared for almost entirely by their families. And if you couldn't be kept at home, where do you think you went?
Prison. No,
because this is before prison.
You got kicked out of town.
No, you just start begging on the streets. Destitute. Okay. That was it. Before these places came about, it's like, if you think about it, homelessness at that point, it's the same as now realistically, right? Like to some degree, in that if you're not able to function in that society and there's no safety net, you're going to end up on the streets. You're going to see a much higher proportion of people who find difficulty with engaging in society, I guess neurotypically and normally the way that a mentally healthy person might. So that's where that sort of comes from. By the 1700s, there were some private institutions where if you're rich and you got a mad family member and it literally says a mad relative, you could just send them there, mad could have a number of meanings. It could be a woman who is speaking above her station, and you're like, oh, wow, we'll get her away. Or it could be a woman who is, reasonably upset about something horrible that was done to her. Get her away. Or it could be someone that has a genuine mental illness.
This actually happened to a family member of mine. I don't know when, but I think it was early 1900s. Basically, he got depressed and sad, and his family sent him away to the Lake District to live on his own.
Sounds all right.
That's quite nice, I suppose. But yeah, I found this out actually like this year. We drove past a house somewhere, and someone in my family was like, "Oh yeah, your great granddad was sent away because he was a bit like not very well mentally, and his family didn't like. He just needed to get better, but he just lived on his own in the Lake District, which I suppose is nice. It's like a sort of nature retreat to a certain extent, but also, yeah, just got kicked out to go live in the countryside.
I'm not gonna lie. When I've been very mentally ill, there's always this little bug in the back of my mind. Just run away and live in the country.
Yeah,
just live in the woods. Because I think that would make me a lot happier in some ways.
Oh, absolutely. And they do it, don't they? There's like nature, like mental health care is often like go spend time in nature. I guess it can sort of reset and reground you to like what the world actually is rather than sort of weird simulation we all live in.
Yeah. I feel like this is, and don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that any sort of mental issues that I've had have been incredibly mild or incredibly severe. I would put them at just past top end of moderate, right? Not the most severe, but I'm no spring chicken, but like Well, I've been around that mental health block a few times. What I mean is, like, I once went out to the countryside for a little sort of writing retreat, and the most, I guess, the best experience for my mental health was literally just being out in the dark at night and seeing all of the stars. I was talking to one of my friends, and we were just chatting, and he was like, "Look at all the stars." I'm like, "Man, it's insane that people have been looking at these stars for, millennia. We are connected to all humanity through this sky, the moon, all of that. Literally just getting this incredible experience with just the night sky." I come back to London and I'm like, oh man, light pollution, bro. And it's just all of these little things where, when you're in that sort of day-to-day city life, there's so many distractions and so many things that kind of pull you away from just kind of connecting to the natural world. And I know it sounds very floaty and like woo nature, but I genuinely do think there is a psychological benefit to just chilling in the woods with some plants and trees and looking up at the stars. Because for me, feeling small and tiny and insignificant in the grand scheme of the universe is so meaningful.
Reassuring.
Yeah, I like it.
Yeah, but isn't it funny how so many of the worries that you have in day-to-day life are caused in part by the sort of crazy simulation we all live in, and I don't mean that in we live in a simulation. I mean that in that society is an abstraction. Everything we do, like going to work and earning money and all these things, they're all abstractions, they're simulations. They're not real things, a grand reality.
Social constructs. Social construct, we're alluding to. Yeah.
Yes, and those things are stressful in part because we didn't evolve for them. We sort of developed them, and we still have a little monkey brain that's trying to go like, oh, what's coming to get me? Oh, is it a snake? Oh, I don't know. And then that game that we play, that society we've constructed, also pumps out a load of light and crap into the sky, so you can't even look at the stars at night and go, oh, I'm reconnected. Because you could theoretically go out, do your sort of weird simulated world thing all day, and then come home, look at the stars and reconnect, reset, and then go out and do it all over again. But we can't even look at the stars anymore.
That's one of the reasons I was really enjoying The Last of Us as well. Just it was so cathartic just to look at the nature in that show, because the way that it was shot and graded it just felt very real. Like, vivid, yes, but it looks the way that the world has looked to me on occasion without feeling terribly heightened. It just felt just so nice.
Yeah.
And again, this is not me saying, oh, let's replace all psychiatric healthcare with sending people out into the woods. Absolutely not. There are genuine sort of mental illnesses that make it difficult to, exist even outside of society, right? Like if you're going through psychosis, it doesn't matter where you are. You're going to have sort of difficulty, right? But I just kind of wanted to touch on the fact that a lot of the things that build up here are, I guess, somewhat societally constructed by society. Like, what you were saying about social constructs there, right? Like work and money and blah blah blah, all of that sort of stuff. They're hijacking that part of our monkey brain that's like, oh, I'm scared, in order to motivate us to do stuff. And I don't know, I feel like having that constantly without the just grounding can be more detrimental than people really pay attention to. But let's get back into the actual science here of psychiatric wards rather than just, our thoughts and feelings on the matter. But so I mean, we were talking about how they sort of had come about in the 1200s and the 1700s. There were few places where wealthy people could be sent, and poor people still had to rely on the church, essentially, which, I mean, charity, right? That's the one thing that the church was really strong with, for a long, long time. And to this day, churches still do a lot of good charity work. Granted, a lot of it is also intended to indoctrinate people into their beliefs, so it's double-edged sword. But you can't fault the fact that they do try and help people, or a lot of religious people do try and help people. And I've also got a quote here about that sort of describes the state of public-run mental asylums in that sort of period. The ones where poor people went, if they didn't end up in a workhouse or prison. So in pauper asylums, we see chains and straight waistcoats, 3 or 4 half-naked creatures thrust into a chamber filled with straw to exasperate each other with their clamour and attempts at violence, or else gibbering in idleness or moping in solitude. Just being treated like animals, basically.
When it says creatures, it means people.
People. Oh, yeah, people.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, no, people.
Yeah.
100%. This is talking about people, yeah.
And they're putting them together. They're not well mentally, and they're stuffing them in a room together.
Yeah, this is pauper asylum. So this isn't for the rich people.
Yeah.
This is for the poor people who didn't end up in workhouses or in prison.
Yeah.
You know, and you know we think today, oh yeah, man, we've got this down. You know, we've got mental health care. We've got psychiatric wards. We're doing a lot of good work. There are so many mentally ill people that are in prison. Like a lot of people that are in prison that could maybe be better served with better psychiatric care. So whilst we've come a long way from the point of having people in straw beds sharing, you know, sharing a room with other half-naked mentally ill people that are being constantly sort of physically restrained, we've not got all the way to actually solving that problem yet. And by 1880, 139 had been built in the US. And apparently these sort of mental asylums, these in the 1800s in the US, were sort of big, grand places, sort of like museums and universities, that sort of vibe. It literally says here, they were symbols of civic pride, just as museums and universities are today. And some became fixtures on the tourist trail. Others also became prisons. In this research, I've found a number of prisons that are repurposed mental health facilities. It used to be, you know, sort of a mental asylum back in the day, and it's now a prison, which, again, is interesting in sort of the way that they are similar societally in a sense, right? It's like you go to prison if we think, you know, you're at fault, and you go to a mental asylum if you're not at fault. Do you know what I mean? That's generally how.
Sure, but you're still trapped.
Yeah, no. Either way, you're still being separated from people.
Yeah.
But it's like you're being separated from people and you're bad, or you're being separated from people because you're ill. And that line is kind of shifted a little bit here and there over the course of history. You know, as to whether you determine people are bad or ill. But let's go through the sort of history of psych wards in the UK. So it was really common to use physical restraints, you know, like straitjackets. That's what those straight waistcoats were. They were talking about. There are. That's not good. The people that were working there were basically just guards. I mean, it was basically kind of like a prison. It literally says here, the function of mental institutions was simply to keep inmates in custody. The keepers were little more than guards, and people would be kept in chairs or restraints for the majority of the time that they were there. I mean, obviously it differed between from institution to institution. Different asylums worked slightly differently, but it was just an accepted part. It was just, this is just how it is. This is just healthcare. Think about it. It's just how we deal with prisons today. Yes, prisons have horrible conditions. Prisons sort of demonstrably negatively impact basically anyone that comes into contact with them. Families and prisoners. It's not terribly common for a prisoner to leave prison and be better off than they were when they went in. And you know, it's a similar situation here where that was just an accepted part of society. It's just, this is just necessary part of healthcare. We need to send people to these places. They get strapped down for a bit, and that's just where they live. But yeah, the idea was obviously controlling antisocial behavior, because you can potentially be more volatile. I mean, that would be one of the reasons that you were sort of sent there. And it also would stop you from harming yourself. So, you know, stop you from harming others, also stop you from harming yourself. But some people were very worried about hurting themselves, and so they would ask to be restrained. But there was a lot of criticism of that, obviously. You know, people said it was demoralizing and whatnot. And it wasn't until 1829 with a man named William Scrivener. What a brilliant name. He was in Lincoln. He was a patient in Lincoln Asylum. And he was found dead from strangulation after being strapped to his bed in a straitjacket and left overnight without supervision.
Wow.
Yeah, and it wasn't. It was after that sort of there was a non-restraint system sort of put in place. It literally says the incident persuaded the authorities at Lincoln to abolish all physical restraints and implement a non-restraint system. Their system was very influential in the 1800s asylum reform and indicative of a wider change in attitudes toward mental illness and the care of mentally ill people. I mean, just the idea of being physically restrained and just left in a bed overnight is horrifying, especially like going through a mental health episode, shall we say. It's already scary enough.
Yeah.
Without having, you know, in a sort of environment where the environment is made as scary as, you know, the environment inside your head, let's say, that doesn't seem remotely helpful. So, you know, after that, they kind of started to bring in better systems for healthcare. So have you heard of the moral treatment system?
No, I have not.
So it was basically towards the end of the 1700s. There was a private mental health institution that was sort of created just outside of York. It was called the Retreat. And essentially, this sort of non-restraint policy that we were talking about, that came into it. It was essentially looking at mentally ill people as people.
No way. What a development.
Can I read you this quote? It says,
go on.
William and Samuel believed that patients benefited from being treated as ordinary people.
Whoa. Geniuses.
Sorry.
Nobel Prize.
Sorry. I can really struggle
£1 million.
They were expected to dine at the table, make polite conversation over tea, and do regular chores. So basically treating them like children, which is mostly treating them like people, right?
Yeah, half people.
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think a child is, usually about 3/5 of a person, depending on the race.
Dear God. We're both being facetious, by the way.
I think children are full people. Society doesn't.
Yeah.
That's it.
Children are people.
We've got an After Dark coming up about that.
They're
so
not
you should
that
definitely
smart,
listen
but
to
they're
it.
people.
Smarter than some people.
They're getting smarter as well, which is a lot better than most of us. Most of us are not getting smarter.
I am definitely not getting smarter.
We're on the way down.
We didn't start from that high. Man, we've got a Benjamin Button situation. Yeah. We started off like pretty good, and now we're
all the way down from here.
Yeah, so this started, I guess, the more sort of modern psychiatric care in inpatient facilities, right? Treating mentally ill people like people. Revolutionary. And it says here that in traditional asylums, patients were mixed together in the same ward, but do you know what these guys might have decided to do under this sort of, I guess, more moral treatment system? So just all the patients shoved together in one ward. What do you think? And this is a very, very obvious thing that they did. Like, as in, if you were working at the time, it just seems so obvious now.
There's always someone there?
No, not even that. It was literally just that they separated patients based on what was going on with them.
Oh, right.
Yeah. Instead of just having them all jumbled together, it's like, oh, you've got similar symptom clusters. Let's deal with you in a different way to everyone else.
You're in one ward. Can you not make each other worse in that way though? Like if you've got delusions and you're sort of sharing delusions with each other.
I mean, if your delusions aren't like, if they don't match up, maybe they'll cancel each other out. Maybe it's like destructive interference.
I heard an amazing thing, by the way. Sorry, this is a tangent, but I heard this thing and I don't know if it's true. I actually would like you to Google this whilst I say it. So I have heard that if you go to, I think it's Jerusalem, and people often go to Jerusalem claiming that they are the second coming of Jesus.
Did that for Luke Stackdo.
Okay, so I think I found it. In 1959, in the Ypsilanti State Hospital, this is in Michigan, 3 men who each believed they were the biblical figure Jesus Christ. Each of the men had been diagnosed with schizophrenia and were soon to be the subject of an ethically dubious and distressing experiment.
You know what? Let's do a bonus episode or a full episode on it. Let us know in the comments if you want to see, some more about this story about, Jerusalem syndrome. But back to these psychiatric wards, the Victorian ones were doing pretty well for the time. And more people started being sent to them. And what it says here is that, but with the growing asylum population, superintendents found that the only way to maintain control in an increasingly overcrowded and poorly staffed county asylums was to resort to restraints, padded cells, and sedatives. And I've got a quote here that says, the magistrates go on adding wing after wing and story after story, contrary to the opinion of the profession and common sense, rendering the institution unfavourable for the treatment of patients. Now, that was from an article in the Edinburgh Review in 1871. Now, basically what we're seeing here is sort of science and experts saying, hey, this is not a good thing to do, but just resources not being allocated properly. And so the cheapest and the easiest thing to do being putting people in padded cells and giving them sedatives so that they're not a problem. And that was around 1871 that sort of happened. And in 1893, there is this specific mental hospital that there's this really great science museum article about. It'll be linked below, obviously. He visited, he saw that there was an absence of decoration, brightness and general smartness, and a want of sufficient ventilation. And his conclusion, I've got it here as a quote, it would be astonishing to find that any cures are ever made there. So essentially, they start like mental asylums started off, sort of in the UK as churches just taking in destitute people off the streets, and a lot of them just happened to be mentally ill, right? Like quite severely mentally ill. They kind of then transitioned into being more what we'd think of today as a psychiatric hospital, with treating patients like actual people. Treating them like children, making them come to the table, do chores and all that sort of stuff. But giving a sort of a regimented, somewhat normal kind of life there. Structure, exactly, yes. Which is so beneficial. Yep. I don't think people understand how beneficial actual structure can be. But after that, they started to do really well, and then more people went to them, and then the funding just wasn't there, and so they changed the approach to be just less beneficial, and it just kind of went in the toilet, really. And if we look at America, by 1890, every state had one or more, at least one, publicly supported mental hospital, and they all just started getting bigger as the country population increased. And as I said, by the 1890s, every state had one or more, but by the 1890s, they were also apparently, it says, under siege. Same situation as in the UK at the time, just money. Just money.
Actually, and now.
Yeah.
So it's not. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Weird that for 130 years we've had the same problem, which is
underfunded public health.
Weird, that
crazy.
Isn't it? So yeah, money was a real issue there, and another thing ended up happening, which is not great. It was to do with the elderly. Can you maybe hypothesize as to what local governments did to cut their costs when it came to the elderly?
Did they kill them?
No. Oh God, no. No, they just sent the elderly to asylums. They changed. No. Okay. No, they changed the. Dear Lord.
I wouldn't put anything past them.
These are white people. They're not black ones.
Oh.
They're not Native American. They're not Hispanic. They're white people generally as well. That was a joke. I'm saying that America will care more about the life of a white person than a not-white person. If you disagree with me and think that I'm being radical, look at history, okay? Just look at it and then get back to me. So essentially what they did was they decided that being senile, let's just change the definition of that slightly so that we can get more elderly people into these insane asylums, as they were called in the day, rather than the government having to sort of pay for care for them in public hospitals and whatnot, right? And so if you spin it as a psychiatric problem, and then you send them to state-supported asylums. So this is the way that the American sort of government works, right? You've got the local government, and you've got the state government, and you've got the federal government, right? So if the local government has its own budget and they have to pay for the care of the elderly within their purview, if they then say, well, actually, these people are senile, so that means state government, you've got to pay for it. So the state government is then fronting the cost where the local government otherwise would.
That's just so dumb. That's just pushing. It's just like accounting. That's just accounting.
It's bureaucracy.
The overall country still has to pay. What? Yeah. That's so dumb.
Yeah. So, I mean, and although local taxes may be different, even though federal sort of state taxes, I don't know, man. All I'm saying here is that what you can see from this is that there is a quite clear pattern of bureaucracy and money getting in the way of good psychiatric care. Yes. Glad we've stopped that, though.
Oh, yes. We live in a perfect utopia now. If you get mentally ill, all the support in the world.
Yeah, or you start a YouTube channel and...
or a podcast.
Or you become a stand-up comic. If you're mentally ill, those are the 3 job options that are afforded to you.
Yeah.
And actually, there's one job option. It's being an entertainer.
Yeah.
That's it. That's the only...
I can juggle. I'll juggle my mental illness away.
But what the Americans ended up doing to try and solve this problem is starting up nurses training schools. So you would kind of, you basically have nurses training in these mental asylums. There was an issue with sort of them and the people that were running these asylums wanting the nurses to have the same qualifications as, a normal medical nurse by the end of their sort of training. That was a bit all over the place because they don't have the same experience. If you think about it, working in a mental hospital is different than working in a traditional hospital in terms of the care that you give as a nurse, right? Yes, you'll probably have to do injections of sedatives and whatnot, but they're there's a lot more stuff going on in a traditional hospital that just does not happen in sort of mental facility. That kind of changed. Over time. I think the sort of nurses' unions just got a bit more power and managed to sort of overturn what these very powerful, compared to the nurses' unions, what these very powerful mental asylums were able to sort of do to influence government. So essentially what happened there is mental asylums were like, we can save money by training nurses here, and we want them to have the same qualifications as normal nurses. Government make that happen. And government was like, yeah, okay. And then the nurses unions were like, hey, no. And so over time that just kind of changed. And that kind of, it doesn't bring you up to now, but that kind of brings you up to maybe the 1900s-ish. By the 1930s, economic crisis, just everything crashed. World War II, so things kind of were a bit up in the air, then. And apparently psychiatrists started looking to be doing more general care than just sort of psychiatric care in that sort of period. So some of them established separate programs called psychopathic hospitals within general hospitals to treat patients suffering from acute mental illnesses. So do you know what I mean by acute? I
actually don't. I hear that word all the time, but I can't remember what it means.
So acute, you might hear it in reference to angles, like acute obtuse.
Yes,
but acute in this context means just sort of not chronic, right? In an instance.
For a bit.
Yes. So if you have a depressive episode lasting, say, a month, you could call that an acute depressive episode. Maybe actually there may be specific guidelines on what is an acute depressive episode, but something that is impermanent, temporary, rather than chronic, long term, right?
Yeah.
That's what acute means in this context. So psychopathic hospitals, sort of basically wards within hospitals that dealt specifically with psychiatric care, started opening up in the US around that time. And it says here, by the mid-20th century, the hospitals housed over 500,000 patients, but began to diminish in size as new methods of treatment became available. Up until that point, between the sort of 1800s to the mid 20th century, that's when you start getting things like insulin and electric shock therapy, psychosurgery, and different kinds of medications.
Insulin?
Yeah. It literally says insulin and electric shock therapy. So I assume insulin therapy is messing with someone's insulin levels. I mean, if you think about it, like, if you go into kind of insulin shock, do you know what insulin does?
Doesn't it do something to do with sugar?
Yes, it's a hormone that basically
regulates blood sugar
regulates
levels.
Blood sugar, essentially, right? So if you think about it this way, if you're diabetic, you generally have a problem with either your sort of sensitivity to insulin or your insulin production, right? And you take insulin to regulate your blood sugar and basically keep your blood sugar levels at the right point. Mm-hmm. Insulin will lower your blood sugar levels. Eating sugar will increase your blood sugar. Well, eating will increase your blood sugar levels, right? Now, if you have too much insulin, or if you take an insulin shot as a diabetic or even as a non-diabetic, but you haven't had enough sort of sugar, your blood sugar will drop. Low. And if you give someone a lot of insulin, their blood sugar will drop to really low levels. What do you think might happen then?
I imagine it sends the body into shock.
Yeah, insulin coma, basically. So that's what this insulin shock therapy was, giving people doses of insulin to send them into basically an insulin coma temporarily. And the idea was that could help. I mean, the same with electric shock.
Reset the body in some way.
Yeah, same with it's the same as electric shock therapy. Like, in theory, in the sense of like shocking the body and
just make it go and then making it resets.
Yeah, turning it off and on again, kind of like and by the 1950s, as I said, over 500,000 patients are sort of in these hospitals, but 1950s was when these sort of mental asylums just stopped really existing. Like they kind of to really start to fall off. Basically, new systems of nursing homes started to take up the elderly. So you didn't have the elderly in these places as much anymore. There were new medications that kind of helped to curb really severe psychiatric symptoms. The sort of mental health care system changed. There was a more sort of community mental health system. That means that if you were sort of suffering from mental illness, you didn't need to leave your community and go to a place. You could get the care in your community and then be within a support system. Again, this is
radical ideas.
I'm seeing a lot of parallels here between
treating people like people, looking after them near their house.
Yeah, but seriously, I'm seeing a lot of parallels here between this and the prison episode that we did, because I mean, again, they are fundamentally a really similar thing. This person is a problem for some reason or another, a danger to others or a danger to themselves in some cases. So let's put them away from everyone else with the intent of making them less dangerous over time. Like, fundamentally, they're the same thing. It's just different reasons for being there. And interestingly, this sort of more community-focused healthcare, community mental health care, that is beneficial, I guess, in a similar way to how house arrest is also quite beneficial.
Exactly.
So we did actually a bonus episode of Psych Guys. You can get it on Apple. You could get it on our Patreon. We did one looking into this during COVID. We had prisoners that were sort of put in under house arrest rather than being in prison, and there were some positive outcomes, it seemed. Ding-a-ling-ling, is that the ad bell?
I think it is, but it's rather quiet this time.
Well, Luke, we want to keep a big old secret about this Psy Guys merch.
Yes. Please do not tell anybody and do not purchase any of it. Otherwise, people will find out.
They might see you wearing our merch or displaying our merch and think, oh, wow, what a cool person. And I'll tell you this, as a cool person myself, having people think you're a cool person can be very, very stressful.
Yeah, we can't have that. And we also can't have you supporting the show to exist that you're enjoying right now.
Yeah, so absolutely under no circumstances should you go to normalcitizen.store and pick up some Psy Guys merch. Some Psy Guys merch like beanies and posters and t-shirts and calendars and cool stuff like that. Definitely don't go to that store and buy that.
Goodness me, that's an awful lot of stuff that I'm not going to purchase.
Absolutely, Luke. Now let's get back to the show before anyone listens to us.
God, I really hope we got away with that one.
So back to more modern psychiatric wards, I kind of want to talk about the effectiveness of them, because that's something that comes up a lot. How effective are they? I mean, we both know people that have, been not necessarily sectioned, but have been in inpatient psychiatric care. And the thing there is that, I mean, the person that I know did benefit from it somewhat, but I remember the period that they were in there, and I was messaging them, constantly. But in some ways it was beneficial, and in others it just wasn't. It was kind of a situation that you were talking about, where you're putting all of these people together, and it's just. It's not necessarily beneficial for every individual to be around other, mentally, really severely mentally ill individuals in that environment. There were some cases of sort of things compounding and people getting, I wouldn't say quite necessarily trauma bonding, but like forming really, really quick and seemingly deep but not long-lasting relationships, intense relationships. Yeah, and it just there was also it was also what seemed to be this sort of real difficulty with not having any control over your environment or your day-to-day life, and having so many sort of restrictions in place. So if we talk about psych wards, sort of modern psych wards, I mean, we've spoken a little bit about what they look like before, but generally they're brightly lit places with no door handles and things like that. You have shoelaces taken away from you. Anything that can be used to cause harm to yourself or others is modified. Like, I mean, you see all these videos on TikTok of people showing that, like, oh yeah, the windows are locked in this way. You only have access to your phones maybe at certain times. Like I saw what was it? Maybe a Louis Theroux documentary, just a clip of it recently, wherein caffeine was removed. Like their access to caffeine was removed. After midday during the week. Sort of things like that. So it again, similar to prison in that a lot of your freedoms are removed. And granted, yes, in this instance, some people are not quite able to take care of themselves, and that's why they're there. So having people, help you do that is beneficial, but also not being able to do any of those things, if you are able to do them yourself, can be kind of a problem. But, the main thing that I seem to find in the research that I've looked at is less about, that sort of stuff, and more about the way things look, like the vibe of these hospitals. Because, I think there's about maybe 2 to 3 papers I've got on this. Essentially, about 2 papers on this. Essentially, these studies from 2014 and I believe 2016, 2016, were looking at basically what psychiatric wards looked like, and what they found is essentially that you could make some changes to make it more homey, make it feel more like an actual place, give you private spaces that you can have. If you add all of those things, apparently the outcomes are a bit better. I also found another study that was looking at aggression and that sort of antisocial behavior, and that was limited by just altering the way that these facilities look and feel. So instead of feeling like a sort of I keep on saying brightly lit because that's something that came up quite a lot. It says here that therapeutic design is thought to be important, but data on its impact on treatment outcomes in psychiatric settings are scarce. Existing studies show a correlation between the availability of private spaces and home-like features and an increase in social interaction and improvements in well-being. So essentially, if you give people more like freedoms, more like these normal things, they have better outcomes. In that, like, if you think about it this way, it's what we were talking about in the prisons episode with the concept of the prison brain. You leave prison,
you're institutionalized.
Yeah, you can't look after yourself
because
you've never had to make a decision. Like if you think about, if you have ADHD, executive dysfunction is a problem that you will have to face near enough daily, right? Now that is not exclusive to ADHD, obviously, but executive dysfunction is something that comes up when people leave prison. And you can understand here that this is a similar thing here, wherein you're not looking after yourself, so you don't have to do it, and so you're not, you're then less capable of doing that sort of down the line.
Yeah.
But if you have more of these sort of normal things, in some ways, the easiest way to sort of describe it is that it helped people feel a bit more normal, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, we're incredibly affected by our surroundings. And you say you don't want to feel like you're in somewhere sanitized and bleak. But also, I think there's a lot to be said about the fact that these institutions are, like, I'm sure people who work in them have the best of intentions much of the time, majority of the time, right? But they're not necessarily always really attacking the root cause of any of the things that they're trying to treat, because, there's all sorts of societal reasons why somebody might develop mental illness. There's trauma stuff that might take years of therapy to undo, which they might not have the resources to actually hit. And also, mental illness is, I imagine, now I'm not quoting data, but I imagine is exacerbated by things like anxiety over how you're going to pay for things. Just real existential things. And it's not obviously for a hospital to fix those things, but it is for a society to structure things so that people don't end up in mental hospitals where we can avoid it. And if they do, they can get better. It's almost like a slightly limited model that's just going, I imagine, is going to do a lot of getting you well enough to leave. Yeah. But the actual underlying things that might have contributed to you being here, there's nothing done about them, and so you are just going to end up coming back. Yeah, I mean, and bear in mind, it's not just things like depression. There's also schizophrenia and psychosis, but then the anxiety and the other things that come along with those, and the stress that can, exacerbate those. Of course. All I mean is you can be genetically prone to schizophrenia and never have it expressed. Yeah. And certain things can happen to you, stresses can happen to you that trigger a schizophrenic or a psychotic episode that might otherwise not have happened. We're in agreement here. I'm agreeing with you. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. This underlying stress. I'm just saying for anyone that's sort of listening and maybe thinking, yeah, but if someone's got psychosis, it doesn't matter what if they can't afford it. They're going to be psychotic anyway. Well, when you look at mental health, a lot of these things can be triggered by stress, and I don't know if we really take seriously the amount of stress that we get put under in sort of modern society. I mean, I've been thinking about this recently, right? There has not been a period in history up until this point where we have had so much information blasted in our face at all times. I mean, back in the day when people couldn't read generally, oh boy. Oh, it must have been so nice to just look around and not have constant information just battering you in the face. Gossip about what the neighbours are doing. Just hear what God's got to say once a week. Look at a funny little fox every now and then. Oh, he's back. Look at that guy. Nice. Give me back my baby. But my point is that, while it may seem that societal factors don't influence these things, yeah, we know that there is some influence there. And I mean, if we look
if we look at sort of rehabilitation, I've got a study here that found that rehabilitative sort of inpatient care was fairly beneficial. I mean, these were people that were in sort of 3 to 4 years, 2 years of rehabilitation, and that was before. That was sort of after already being in hospital, and some of them weren't released to sort of independent life. Some of them were released to care homes. Some of them were released to different sort of hospitals or different sort of community healthcare systems. But generally, yeah, I mean this sort of rehabilitation can be beneficial. So I don't want to give the idea that sort of inpatient facilities are entirely bad. Absolutely not.
No way.
There's just a lot of things we could do to improve them. So I've actually found a study from 2022, I think October or September, that looked at Italy and the United Kingdom, 18 total psychiatric hospitals, totaling 2,130 patients. And they kind of want to look at things that were features that you only find in psychiatric hospitals, right? Like sort of sex segregated spaces and restricting access to sharp, pokey, pointy things that you can hurt yourself or others with.
Just like a prison, by the way.
Yeah.
Sex segregated and also no pointy things.
Exactly. And I mean, and again, we're drawing the parallels here. We understand the different needs for both of them.
Yes.
But there are definite problems with both. One of them, I think we should really just get rid of more or less completely. And the other one is, I can see benefits to it, but it should be very much restructured, I think. I mean, I question whether community care can be structured in such a way that it could fill in for this sort of these inpatient psychiatric facilities, or at the very least, sort of improving people's access to their support systems when they're in these facilities, so that they don't necessarily need to feel as though they've been completely removed from society and their family and whatnot. So I distinctly remember, when someone I knew was in an inpatient facility, it was really difficult to visit. There were only specific times that you were allowed to visit them, and only specific amounts of people were allowed to go, and there were very specific rules. Not as strict as a prison, of course, but on that kind of gradient, you know what I mean? And I get it. You need to have structure. You want to make sure that people aren't being, their problems aren't being exacerbated by too many people coming in and all of that sort of stuff. But then also, like, having access to a support system like a family or friends or loved ones can be incredibly beneficial.
And I think I don't know, again, but I would guess that the specific time when you can have visitors is more for the benefit of the staff than for the patient.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Like, you can make an explanation as to why it might be good for the patient. You could say you can only visit for 2 hours a day because we need to have some structure. We need to have but that's for the staff. Because it surely is stressful to constantly have people wandering in and out.
Yeah, I'm not saying it should be absolutely open, but a little bit less of a sort of prison feeling could potentially be beneficial.
Because one of the questions they ask you when you go for any kind of therapy or depression stuff is, do you have a good support network? Yeah. And if you are artificially removed from your support network, probably not going to be very helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, to be honest as well, I don't know as well. I mean, you could almost consider a situation where, visiting could help that support network be better at being a support network for you. Yeah. Do you know what I mean? Come and visit. Oh, why don't you come and sit in on this and we can have a little bit of a chat. We could do this and that. I mean, obviously, money is the main thing. But hey, I don't know. Maybe we spend less on nuclear weapons and we spend more on people's brains and people would be happier. Who knows? I don't know. But so if we look back at this study between Italy and the UK, it says here that the two main features that affected the satisfaction of patients were the options of having rooms to meet their visiting family off the ward and mixing the sexes of the hospital units. Surprisingly, both of these factors affected women more than men in the patient survey responses, despite previous literature suggesting that hospitals were built in a segregated way to prevent sexual harassment and assault. Now, look, I understand this. I'm not going to sit here and say that women do not need spaces that are just for women, segregated spaces such that they don't need to feel stress or fear of this sort of sexual harassment, right, and assault. But
especially when the people around them might be more unpredictable as well. Not necessarily more likely to do anything, but more unpredictable.
No, absolutely, yeah. But what I would say is that if it is of the opinion of the people going in here that they would much rather not be in that kind of sex segregated space, which again, sex segregated spaces end up developing certain cultures and whatnot. It can be a bit weird, especially, if you've got to adjust from going to something like that back to normal modern society. I mean, again, I understand looking at the safety of women. Absolutely. But clearly this is not something that, at least at the very least, these women in these 18 different facilities want. Right?
They didn't want it.
Yeah, no, they don't want it,
right.
And it should be a thing of choice. Like, I genuinely think that a bit more agency could be beneficial to a lot of different people. And I don't just mean in this context. I mean in many contexts, we have our agency taken away from us an awful lot. Now, it says the Italian hospitals had wards that were mixed sex just because their psychiatric units were in hospitals, so they were built as a sort of, let's say, an addendum to a hospital, like adjoining a hospital. Like it literally says in the same facility. But the US and UK, we're sort of more prone to having these sort of psychiatric wards just completely separate in their own place. So it says here as well that the authors caution that the psychiatric issues may not fully be cared for with just that implementation alone, as patient satisfaction can vary by age, illness stage, and interaction with staff. So it's the biggest study of this kind to date, but we're still limited, right? We've not done enough of these studies. We need to do more. Obviously, I thought there'd be a lot more information on this topic, because it just seems a very obvious thing to study, right?
Well, but we just don't do enough. We don't treat mental health anywhere near as seriously as we do physical health. So no, I actually am not surprised at all.
Yeah, looking, thinking about it, I'm like, okay, I guess, but. I thought there are not that many. I cannot stress to you how few there are. I'm looking between 2014, 2016, and 2022, and they're in that 8-year period. All of the studies are saying much more research is needed in this area. And I know studies always say more research is needed, but these are saying there is definitely not enough research here. Like, we definitely need more. There's a little bit of a difference between a study saying more research is needed, because scientists always say that, because that's how they get paid. I'm joking. But there's a difference between saying
and
that.
I can do it for you for a fee.
Give me a grant, please. There's a difference between saying that and saying that there's just not enough research on this. There are just very few studies, and so many of these papers start off with, there are not enough studies in this area, but here's one, please, let's do more. From what it seems, from what I gather here, it seems that essentially the way that we've constructed psychiatric hospitals is not absolutely the best way of doing it. If we think about the sort of history of them and the development of them, they've basically evolved from initially church-run charities for homeless people to prisons but mixed with a hospital and a primary school and minimum security prison. And if you think about them in the context of society, like, again, this is going to be me sounding maybe a bit too radical, but if we think about them in the context of society, they serve the same purpose. And you might be saying yes, but and you might be saying no, psychiatric hospitals are, to help people get well. How can you say that? They serve the same purpose.
They're primarily to keep people away from people.
Yeah.
And then make them better whilst they're there. But we could make them better we could make them better in their own homes. Or some of them at least. Or
we could restructure these psychiatric hospitals to be much better at making people better. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, that'd be nice.
There are a lot of seemingly quite obvious changes that could be made to, and not even necessarily difficult ones. It kind of seems that, access to family members, private spaces to see family members, not segregating people by sex if that's not what they want, and just having a more homey environment. Yeah, somewhere that doesn't feel like you're locked in a place, against your will. It's not necessarily entirely broken, right? There are people who have benefited from these places, and they can be quite useful, but they're not quite as good as they could be yet. We've got quite a bit of a way to go, and there just needs to be more research on exactly what we need to do to make things better. And that's basically it. I've got another study that kind of looks into the patient's perspective that I would definitely recommend reading. It will be linked below. We can maybe do a bonus episode on it or something. We just don't have enough time today, but it's got so many great quotes in it. It's a qualitative study, so it doesn't look at large volumes of data and compare them sort of quantitatively. It doesn't look at the numbers and try and draw conclusions from that. It's basically a lot of interviews with a lot of different people that were in these facilities to see what their opinions were. And yeah, it's just really interesting stuff. So for here it says, for me, it's very important that the staff recognize me and know who I am and how it's been before, and at the same time see how I am now, that they see a change has actually occurred. When I feel really bad, I might say the same things as before. Perhaps there are no other words than the same words, but you could still have come further in some way, right? So like if we're looking at this study, it's just really seeing what the people in there are experiencing, and there's this disconnect between at least this patient and staff, where maybe the mindset that some staff have in that facility is not geared towards improving someone's mental health. It says here, it is that to be able to both laugh and at the same time be serious, because it's when you can get that contact. If you feel that you're on the same level, then you get a different relationship. Basically, just a more human connection.
Yeah, that's so important.
And it's what we were talking about earlier, right? That kind of very obvious treating patients like people is something we're still kind of working on, right?
Yeah.
And we make jokes there, but like somehow we're still trying to get there.
Yeah, it's so important. I feel like we definitely don't do enough in our mental health service or in our general health service at all to incentivize people who want to help people, because I think so often, it's getting too broad, it's getting too like societal, but our incentives are all off. And so often we are incentivized, like people who don't actually want to help are incentivized to do a job because it pays better than their alternative. And people who actually would quite like to help are incentivized not to do those things because those things actually don't pay enough and they could earn more money elsewhere or in the private sector or that kind of thing.
Or getting into, so the thing when it comes to healthcare, doctors, what baffles me is that I know plenty of people that went into medicine for money, that they just don't really care about. They're not like, I would go into medicine to basically do the training that you do, where you get to pull eyeballs out of cadavers and stuff. That's why I would do it.
What?
I think it'd be fun to do that. It's the only way that you're legally allowed to do that, and I would go through studying medicine at university just to pull some eyes out of some cadavers. And that's why I shouldn't be a doctor, because I'm not going in it.
Yeah.
I wouldn't be going into it to help people. I should be a surgeon.
You're going in to mutilate them.
I should be a surgeon because I'm going in to
mutilate them.
To have a little peek and see what's going on.
We're such different people.
But
what?
But my point is, I know people that went into medicine for money, but then there's also people that can't go into medicine because of money. Because it costs too much to get in there, and when you're studying medicine, having a job at the same time is really bloody difficult. I would say almost more so than other degrees. And essentially, what we've got there is a bunch of people who are medical professionals who don't really care about helping other people, and then we've got a bunch of other people who, I think we've spoken about this before, where it's like people who go into care, people who go to work in care homes for the elderly and whatnot, where they are they're wiping people's arses and stuff, and they're like doing this very basic care stuff that most people would not want to do, and I mean you've got to deal with people with dementia who could be exposing themselves or becoming violent or being getting very, very scared, and you have to deal with that sort of episode in there, and they are not being paid very much.
No.
Like realistically speaking, if you look at people that are doing that, I would say very, very difficult job, emotionally draining care job, compared to how much some doctors are paid, like that doesn't match up. But these people care about care. They may just not have had the resources to go into medicine, or the sort of the encouragement and whatnot. And if you kind of flip things a little bit, so you've got people who just want to make money doing, I don't know, tech billionaire nonsense, send them to Silicon Valley and have them invent the bus again.
I found it mind-blowing when I found out. I was talking to some physicists and finding out how many egos there are in physics.
Oh my God, don't. Physicists, look, I'm not going to fully insult physicists. I think physicists are the worst of the crop.
But like, just find out what the universe is, Matt. Why are you getting so egotistical about it?
Yeah.
Just find out what the universe is. And obviously the incentive structures are not incentivizing that in the correct way either. But like, go and do something in the private sector. The private sector is the place for egos. The public sector, or anything that is funded by the public sector, is for having your food and house and stuff paid for so that you can do stuff that's good for society, humanity, our general knowledge, stuff like that. Like, that's what it's for. Go and be a dickhead in the private sector.
No, absolutely. And, you know, this is tying directly into what this study is kind of talking about, because the conclusion of it says here, it is clear that what the participants in this present study require is neither extravagant nor time-consuming or expensive. It is actually quite reasonable and could be time-saving in the end. Quality interactions, that is closeness to staff in ordinary relationships and spending quality time through simple activities, would improve patients' experiences of everyday life in psychiatric inpatient care and thereby contribute to their recovery. The staff need to review their priorities by reflecting on what kinds of activities they engage in. Attention to the simple things can increase the quality of interactions and support the development of an environment that can support recovery. So, I mean, this study, you know, and when is this from? Let me just quickly check. This study is from 2016. So, I mean, that's 7 years ago. You know, it's saying, yeah, just having a personal connection with people can really, really improve patient outcomes. And this is speaking to actual patients, people who have actually, you know, sort of been through this. So the conclusion for this for me, I guess, is not that psychiatric inpatient care is fundamentally broken beyond repair, but just that the incentives that society places on, you know, on that sort of institution, it's not necessarily congruent with the intended outcomes of it, right? So it's clear here that basically creating more of a homey environment with actual personal connections where people can still be people despite the fact that they're not mentally well enough to be able to fully take care of themselves in modern society for the current moment, right? Doing all of these things can help people. They can improve outcomes. And I guess that's what we need to do. More evidence-based healthcare, evidence-based changes. Let's care less about the financial worries of it and like actually work on helping people. Because realistically, right, like if you look at this from a capitalist mindset, if you invest money into this stuff, you have more workers.
Get them back to work. Pay their taxes.
And you have more voters to get kids down the mines. Children want to be down the mines. Let's get them down the mines.
I'm amazed that we managed to do an entire episode. Well, I'm about to ruin it, but do an entire episode on essentially mental health care, quote unquote, insane asylums, etc., without talking about lobotomies.
Yeah. We didn't talk about that. That was one of the ones that they brought in way back when, you know, the electroshock therapy and whatnot. Not good.
How'd it go?
I don't want to talk about it.
A resounding success? Should we do the quickfire quiz?
Yeah, let's do the quickfire quiz.
Dun 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 dun. Psychiatric ward edition.
So the rules for the quickfire quiz are the same as always. Luke, I will ask one question. That's one question between you and the audience. And the first person to answer the question correctly after I finish asking the question wins. And what is it they win, Luke?
1 get out of psychiatric ward free card.
Oh, buddy.
It's a jail reference.
I get it.
It's not a very good prize.
So,
you probably shouldn't use it if you need to be there. I'm sorry.
So my question for you is, in what century is the first known mental asylum in the UK?
It is in the 1200s to the 13th century.
Ding, ding, ding.
Hell
That
yeah!
is correct. Well done, Luke. Let us know down in the comments if you beat Luke. But that is it from us today. We want to thank all of our patrons with an extra special thank you to executive producers Denito and Glitch Rabbit, and thank you for watching. You can find the full references for this episode down in the description. Subscribe to new episodes every Sunday and leave us a nice wee comment. You can support the pod at patreon.com/Psy Guys, or you can find and contact us at Psy Guys Pod on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and at Psy Guys on TikTok too. Or you can send us an email at psyguyspod@gmail.com.
That's psyguyspod@gmail.com. Psyguyspod
At gmail.com. You can follow me at NotCor everywhere.
You can follow me at Luke Cutforth everywhere.
Oh, bye.
Bye.